This is just like a small question. Not necessarily, but would it be possible to post these slides as a PowerPoint instead of like document? Because it's easier to see it in Blackboard instead of downloading it.
Yeah, sure.
I've been saying that.
Thank you.
Like it does.
I'm posting the slides on the Open Science Framework, like my personal page where I put my list of course materials. I'll send a link to that.
Thank you.
All right, let's get started, everybody. So by today, or frankly, you could do it before anytime before the take home. I'd like you to read that third chapter. When I was reviewing it, it is a little bit technical, and it's also it's a little bit technical and a little bit mathy. I thought that the first part of it does a reasonable job of reinforcing some stuff about contrast, playing orthogonal contrast, whatever. Mostly though, what I want you to have it for is as a reference, because it goes through a ton of different kinds of procedures that some of which we'll cover today. So I just want you to have it there for your notes if you need it. Whether you understand all the details of the various post-hoc procedures, frankly, I don't care that much, and I'm not going to test you on those details. In fact, I'm sort of ambivalent about most post-hoc procedures, as I'll talk about today. Where we're headed next, so we're going to have a pretty brief unit, like a 2-class unit, I think, on philosophy of science. The reason I decided to do this, this is one of those flat slots that I said that we have available. So for one thing, we're at this like in-between stage where we're in between nature like statistical units, and I like to fill those with some one-off topics that I think are useful. Also, I think some concepts in the philosophy of science unit connect to a few themes that have come up over the course of talking about contrast, like which tasks correspond to which theories, and how do you know whether a test even bears on the theory, and issues like that. So I thought it might be nice to give you some backgrounds and have some formal principles to connect those ideas to. I haven't completely settled on which readings that I want you to do. I'm pretty sure I'm going to have a reading from this book by Zoltan Dienes called Understanding Psychology as a Science. It's really good, and I think that I've read the whole book, and I think the book is great. I can decide which excerpts I want, and I'd also like to work in some papers by Paul Neal, because Paul Neal is a badass, and I think it would be helpful for you to have some background in that. So anyway, I don't want to overwhelm you with readings for that kind of brief unit, but there are just a lot that I think are great. So I'll have those off as soon as I can. So today we're going to have this, our last lecture on categorical variables with 3 or more levels. Before we get to today's topic, I wanted to pick up just one, have one brief jaunt back to the issue of interactions with categorical variables with 3 or more levels. I had a couple people ask me about that second homework question, and I think that homework question was doable if you have a sharp memory of how we handled interactions from last semester, but I understand if you don't, and I think it might be worth actually reviewing how to approach a problem like that. So let's say that we're working with 2 variables that are allowed to interact with each other. One of them is coverage condition, coded like so. So the nothing group is the reference group in this example. And one of them is an indicator for distance x, male versus female, coded like so. Let's further say that I've given giving you a table of means to work with. So as we've learned, one way of understanding contrasts is that there are specific operations on group means. So if we fit an interactive model with these variables, so the two contrasts for average condition, the one contrast for participant sex, this is the statistical model that we're working with. So it's an interactive model. We've got an intercept, of course. We've got 3 separate variables, one for each contrast. And then we've got 2 interaction terms. One where the C1 contrast for beverage condition is allowed to interact with participant sex. Another one where the other contrast for beverage condition is allowed to interact with sex. We've worked with models like this. It's an interactive model from DLM. So let me pause here. Given the way that I've coded beverage condition and participant sex, so what I'm going to show you in a bit is I'm going to fill in numbers and actual contrast variables for everything up here. But if you had to guess, given those contrasts and this table of means, what would you expect the intercept for the model to be? Which number would you expect it to be? Perfect. And nothing females is 2. Everybody see why that is? So the intercept is always the predicted value at 0 on all the predictors. 0 on all of our predictors is the mean of the nothing female group. Everybody follow? Okay. So let's move to the next variable. Let's say that I'm going to be replacing x sub a with the C1 contrast for beverage. So it's that top row for beverage condition. So that's what's going to go in there. And it will also fill in x sub b with C2, x sub c with the contrast for sex. What would you expect the coefficient for C1 for beverage to be? First of all, what does the C1 contrast for beverage condition even represent?
Mean difference between nothing and placebo.
It's the mean difference between nothing and placebo. Great. So that contrast is going to be allowed to interact with sex. And sex is coded such that 0 represents humans. So given that information, what would you expect the coefficient for that beverage condition contrast to be?
3 minus 2. Placebo female minus nothing female.
Yes, absolutely. So this is going to represent the mean difference among females of the placebo group and the nothing group. That's what the C1 contrast is. It represents that mean difference. And if that contrast is allowed to interact with sex, we have to think about that contrast at 0 on the sex contrast, which is females. Everybody following that logic? Obviously, we could go through each coefficient here and go through the same exercise. It will be possible to fill in all of these coefficients using that table of means. I'm not going to do that right now, but that might give you some sense of how this equation connects back up to the table of means and the contrast coding. Each of these coefficients represents a specific quantity that you can calculate from the table of means. Yeah, so here I'm just replacing each variable, or each the x's with the generic x's with the actual variables that will go in. And if you go through that long process of like thinking about how the contrasts connect up to the means, these are the coefficients that you get. If you really want to test your understanding, something that I recommend that you do is go back through the slides and without looking at this slide, try to fill in what these coefficients are. You can imagine this would be the kind of thing that might be tested if whenever we get to the in classes.
So for your third x, or x sub c, that's the mean difference between males and females at nothing, at the reference group of nothing, right?
Yes, absolutely.
So it's 4 minus 2, 2 minus 4.
I'm sorry, which coefficient are you talking about?
X sub c.
Oh, so x sub c is going to be the mean difference between males and females in the nothing group. Is that what you said? Yeah. So everybody see why that is? You have to interpret the coefficient for sex at 0 on beverage condition. 0 is the nothing group. Yeah.
I have a question. On the homework, we didn't have this table of means. So then.
Yeah, so that's where I'm going next. Another way that you can use this equation now that we have it is that you can plug in specific numbers for, say, the C1 contrast or the C2 contrast that correspond to a group that you care about. So to be a little bit more specific, let's say that we were interested in the effect of sex, or predictions about overall shock in the group that received nothing. Well, if I want to get predictions in the nothing group, what I need to do is just plug in those numbers that correspond to the nothing group, 0 and 0 for C1 and C2. So I can literally just take this equation and plug in zeros for C1 and C2, do a little bit of algebra.
Is that for the main effect or the simple effect?
This would be the simple effect for sex in the nothing group. So this number right here, the 2, is that simple effect for sex, the male versus female difference, mean difference in the nothing group. It's that 4 minus 2 that we were talking about.
So when I went to Oxford with Austin, the way he told me to do it was when finding like this simple number, was just to cancel out anything that doesn't include what you're like the coefficient of interest. Like don't worry about the intersex. Like anything that has that term in it, just cancel that.
I have to see what specifically he was saying for you to do. I don't think that'll always work if I'm understanding his suggestion, because if you want to know what's happening in the placebo group, you need to put in a 1 for the C1 contrast. That's what C1 is in the placebo group.
Right, so like, he had, so for this one, like, so the simple effect of sex and nothing, so like anything that didn't have, like, sex, you just cancel out. And it sounds like that's not correct.
That's not correct, yes.
So it sounds like there's, this is pretty huge. Between you and Austin.
Yeah, so I wasn't there, I'm not sure what the logic was. In order to get a prediction for a particular group, you need to plug in the numbers that represent that group. So the way we moved from text labels to numbers is that we assigned numbers to the text labels in order to get from numbers to the text labels to know what's happening, say, in the placebo group, we need to plug in the appropriate numbers. Yeah.
Is it possible for you to work with this with our homework question strategy? Or just talk us through that?
A key is going to be posted, so if you want to see the numbers like in the context of the homework problem, consult the key.
So after we turn it.
Yeah.
So, okay.
The homework is for completion. I would like you to, attempt to apply this logic to the homework problem. But it's not a big deal if you just say, I'm just going to throw this in. I mean, that's not. Okay, so this is the simple effect of sex in the nothing condition. If we want to do this, find the simple effect of sex for the placebo condition, we go through a similar process. So
Just going back to the previous one, to be clear, the simple effect is 2 because you're just looking at the coefficient 2, you're not intersect that.
yes. So this coefficient right here is the simple effect of sex in the nothing condition. And if we plugged in a particular number for males versus females, we find the predicted value for, say, females in the nothing condition. Right, so you go through a similar process if you want to know what's happening in the placebo condition. If you do the algebra, you'll find that the coefficient for sex is 0 in this case. Makes sense if you look at the placebo condition, the mean is 3 in each case. That's the simple effect of sex in the placebo condition. And likewise, you can go through maybe a very similar process for the alcohol condition, plug in the appropriate numbers, and if you do the algebra, we'll find the simple effect of sex in the alcohol condition as well. So, yeah, go ahead.
So one cool feature about using dummy coding with this is that because it's 0 and 1 for sex, the simple effects will always be the difference between the male and female for each group.
Yes.
So how would it be different for those effects coding or?
If I had done -0.5 and +0.5, I'd still get the same simple effects because they're that's still unit weighted. So remember, the thing that makes these interpretable as mean differences is the unit weighting. It's the fact that there's a distance of 1 between the minimum value and the maximum value. Whether you use dummy coding versus contrast coding really goes back to, I think, ought to go back to your hypothesis and how specific it is. So one way of thinking about main effects is that they're sort of the average of the simple effects. So if I want to find the average difference between males and females, I could have just averaged these 3 simple effects. And one way to see that is main effects they're sometimes called marginal means. So you take the mean of 2, 3, and 0, and 4, 3, and 1, and then find the difference between those averages. Well, that's cool.
So on our homework, it asked for the 2 main effects of the contrast and the mean. Is that the same process to figure out?
Yes.
Repeat the process, sorry. Of finding the mean effects, like not, or just averaging.
Sure. So another way of thinking about main effects is that it's the mean difference across the averages within males and females. So you can take the average of 2, 3, and 0, and the average of 4, 3, and 1, top row and bottom row, and find the difference between those averages. That would work out to the same thing as this averaging the simple effects.
So could you find it in the equation?
You can't directly read it out unless maybe if I thought about it that kind of way. It's probably true if like someone showed me there's probably a way it's not obvious to me. I'd say, yeah, probably the best way is to find the 3 simple effects and then take the average. That would get you there. Any questions about this?
On an exam situation, would you have a table of these, or would you just have an equation?
I mean, I'm not going to tell you that. This is the kind of problem that I've given you in the past, right? Where you work with a prediction equation or with raw data and try to apply these same concepts. So probably you will have some sort of problem like this because I think this is a good way to demonstrate understanding. What specific information I give you, I mean, wouldn't be a fair test if I told you.
I definitely understand this a lot better now, but one thing that was frustrating to me is that when I do go to office hours, I was told to do it incorrectly. So is there a way like that Austin can give like key to some of these problems? Because it's just like if you go, it's really frustrating not to get
For sure.
correct information.
I'll investigate where that miscommunication happened. Sorry that you were given incorrect information. Anyway, I hope this does clarify things.
Yeah.
We did have a key for the homework, but like I said, maybe there was miscommunication. Any other questions? Okay, so we're finally on this last case of the 3 cases, the totally unplanned comparisons or somewhat unplanned comparisons. The research scenario that motivates this case is, let's say that I'm still working with startle response. So this is a measure of, we're supposed to be a measure of anxiety again. I happen to have in a pre-screen survey the states that people come from. I might believe that people from different states have different levels of anxiety. But I don't have enough information to make any specific predictions about it. I just might believe this. So I'm not at a place where I can say, okay, people from Arkansas are going to have higher levels of anxiety than people from New York. Not at that level, but I might have some reason to believe, for example, that one of the states is going to have higher levels of anxiety than another state. So let's say I have my data and I'm just curious. So I end up looking at say, descriptive statistics. So right here, I'm using describe by to get a bunch of descriptive statistics within each of the state groupings. If you look up along the column that says mean, you'll see there does seem to be some state variation in startle response in anxiety. If I do an exploratory graph, kind of like this, you can also see that the red lines are means. So you also see some variation in means. In particular, it looks like New York might be a bit higher than the others.
I mean, on the graph it is, but on the descriptives, it looks like
Mm.
it's not
I did modify these data. I think this was an old graph. I'll replace it. Sorry about that. I believe the labeling is just off and it should be Arkansas. It's just that the order got switched around. Anyway, basic idea, there does seem to be some variation across the different states. So one way I could approach this is I could say, well, it certainly looks like Arkansas has higher levels of variation. At least if we looked at that table of means, right? So maybe what I can do is do some dummy code. So I can treat Arkansas as the reference group and just compare using dummy codes the average level of anxiety among the Arkansas group to the average level of anxiety in each of the other 4 groups. So that gives you 4 contrast variables, 4 mechanical variables, each of which represents one of those mean differences. We've learned how to approach problems like this before. So you can literally create those contrast variables in your data frame. Add them as predictors and fit a model using LM. And you get some results like this. So of course, the intercept is going to be the average level of anxiety among Arkansans, and each of these represents a mean difference. And it looks like, according to these significance tests, that there are significant differences of Arkansans compared to the other groups. So let's think back about what we just did. This is my hypothesis, and I mentioned that it's kind of a vague hypothesis. Are there other ways I could have tested this hypothesis besides the one that I just did? Let's imagine that you hadn't seen any of the data at all. You hadn't seen any. You hadn't seen any like means or any graphs. How else might you have approached this question? So one thing that I could have done differently is that it's kind of arbitrary when I made the reference group. I just happened to make Arkansas the reference group. And that kind of suggests that there are other pairwise comparisons that I could have tested to test this hypothesis. What other approach might I have taken?
You also compare, like, do it based on like population density comparisons.
Sure, I could have weighted the groups differently, or I could have made the reference group the one that has the highest population density. Anything else?
Could you have done a POC?
Sure, so do you have anything specific in mind?
Random, you have one group or two states compare to each other, then another two states, and then another two states, and then the final two states.
Absolutely. So I could like take pairs of groups and average them together, and then say code together 1, 0. That's one approach. I talked about these things called polynomial contrasts, where I look for a linear effect and a quadratic and a cubic and say, I don't know what the 4th degree one is called, but that 4th degree one, whatever it is. And also, if I'm doing linear contrast, I could order these groups however I want. So it doesn't have to be, Arkansas is the lowest and New York is the highest. Texas could be the lowest and Kansas could be the highest. I also talked about this type of contrast called Helmert contrasts. So the way Helmert contrasts work is you compare Arkansas to the average of the other 4, then Texas to the average of the other 3, then Kansas to the average of the other 2, and so on. There are a lot of different ways that I could test this hypothesis, right? This hypothesis is vague. And the way it's vague is that specifically multiple different kinds of contrasts, if they are non-zero, could be used to support this hypothesis. It's sort of like there's a family of different comparisons, a very large family, all of which bears on this one hypothesis. So when I'm looking at results kind of like this, it raises some ambiguity, right? Because I took one approach that is a little bit arbitrary, and the very fact that it's arbitrary kind of cast doubt on whether, maybe I just happened to create contrasts that were most likely to result in me confirming my hypothesis. In fact, I did. I said, I'm going to make the reference group Arkansas. The one that I happened to see was highest in anxiety. So this is just laying out that point that I was making before. If I'm trying to figure out how to test this hypothesis, I have specifically 10 different pairwise comparisons that I could choose from. And you can imagine if I had, say, 6 states, it would be an even larger number. This will increase combinatorically as you add in extra groups. And there's actually literally an infinite set of planned orthogonal contrasts that I could choose from. Past a certain point, past a certain number of groups, the number of planned orthogonal contrasts that you can create is limitless. So this seems like a problem. It's specifically a problem that was created due to the vagueness of my hypothesis. The fact that it was vague and it was unclear how to test it gives me flexibility when I am choosing how to test it. So I want to connect this back to some concepts that we talked about last semester. So last semester, we talked about these things called false positives or type 1 errors. They're when you say that you can reject the null hypothesis, but actually the null hypothesis is true. So it seems like this problem of flexibility in how we test the hypothesis raises the potential of a higher type 1 error rate. So what I mean by that is that each of these different choices of which comparison or which contrast to focus on gives me another bite at the apple of rejecting the null hypothesis. And if I do this a bunch of times, I might be more likely to reject the null hypothesis than not, even if the null hypothesis is true, even if there are no differences between states. What's also interesting about this is if we're not focused on the set of contrasts, so not thinking about like all of these, but if at the beginning of my study I had some reason to believe that Arkansas will have higher anxiety than Texas, so that's the primary test that I would say test my research hypothesis. Well, let me ask you, so we're just considering one of these tests. What do you think the type 1 error rate is going to be for just one of those tests? If I was living in this world where I had some reason to believe that Arkansas is really different from Texas, what's going to be the error rate, the type 1 error rate for that comparison? Whatever I set off to, exactly. So probably 0.05. And that's true of all of these tests when considered individually. So I have control over the error rate of the test, where my error rate is kind of getting out of control. It's where it's being inflated beyond what I want, is when I'm considering the set of tests that could potentially bear on this vague hypothesis. There's some specific terms that you might see in papers or textbooks that apply to these concepts I was just talking about. So the type 1 error rate as applied to a specific contrast or a specific test is often called the test-wise error rate. So that is controlled just by setting alpha as we've always done when we're doing null hypothesis significance testing. This other type of error rate, the error rate of the set of contrasts that might potentially bear on a particular question, is often called the family-wise error rate. Or when we're talking about false positives specifically, the family-wise false positive rate. Basic idea again is that in some cases, a much larger set of potential tests could be used to falsify the null hypothesis. That set is the family that's being talked about here. You also sometimes see, I think the Kirk paper talks about this concept. You might see it in other places too, this idea of experiment-wise error rates. Experiment-wise just means it's considering everything that you did in the experiment. I'm not going to talk about the experiment-wise error rate in detail because I don't think it's particularly interesting. For me, what is interesting is the error rate when you're trying to provide support or refute a particular theory. That's why I'm focusing on the family-wise error rate. But you sometimes see this term thrown out. Sometimes it's used interchangeably with family-wise. So I just want you to know that it's up there. So this is my assertion. This is my argument. Just want to own that and say where it's coming from. I think you should control your error rate at a level that corresponds to how specific your hypothesis is. So if you have a vague hypothesis, which is fine, sometimes that's all you can do is make a vague hypothesis. The cost that you have to pay for that vague hypothesis is, well, some special correction procedures for controlling the family-wise error rate. The broader, that broader hypothesis that you get means that you have to think about a larger family of tests instead of one specific test that bears on your hypothesis. And I want to be very clear here that there's nothing inherently wrong with having vague hypotheses. Psychology is still a pretty young field. A lot of the things that we're interested in, we don't have a lot of knowledge about. That's just the state of the world. There's nothing like bad about that necessarily. So, if your hypothesis is vague, your hypothesis is vague, but the implication of that is that you might have to think more carefully about this concept of, which set of tests bears on your hypothesis, and how do you control the error rate at the level of that set. In contrast, part of the benefit of having a very specific hypothesis when you're able to do that is that you don't have to worry about this family of tests. You can just think about that specific test. So that can be really nice when it's possible to make a prediction that's specific. So the principle that I want you to take away from, or one of the principles I want you to take away from this lecture overall is that if you are in a situation where your hypothesis is vague, part of that vagueness means that lots of different things could bear in that hypothesis, and you might have to think about the set of possible results that could bear in your hypothesis rather than one specific. One term that you often see when you're in this world where you're testing vague hypotheses is exploratory research. Sometimes actually in exploratory research, you don't have any hypotheses at all. You might have some reason to be interested in a specific thing, and you just want to collect information about that thing. That's often called descriptive research. Descriptive research is great. I've done it. Lots of fun to do it. There's nothing inherently wrong with it. And actually, sometimes in descriptive research, you shouldn't be testing hypotheses at all. Maybe you shouldn't be thinking about p-values. Maybe instead you focus on effects and confidence intervals, or there's an approach called estimation, basically, that's focused on just patterns and levels of error around those patterns. And it's not thinking about like having a hypothesis. And that's totally fine. The danger comes from thinking that you're doing, or I guess fooling yourself that you're doing more confirmatory research. So I'll often call this more hypothesis testing sort of research, when in reality, your hypothesis is really vague, and you're actually doing exploratory research. That's the kind of situation where you might get a false positive grade that is unacceptable. So just to reiterate, nothing wrong with exploratory research. It's great, it's necessary, it's good for theory building, but just know when you're doing exploratory research and when you're doing confirmatory research. Okay. So I've laid out this idea of how multiple patterns can be used to support your hypothesis when your hypothesis is vague. And maybe you want to do some sort of special procedure to cope with the situation if you find yourself in it. So I'd say there's basically a two-step process. And in the latter step, there's like a lot of ways to do it. But almost always the first step is to identify what that family of tests is that bears on your hypothesis that you can use to support your hypothesis. And this can be pretty hard, actually. One principle that you can think about is you're looking for tests that examine interrelated questions. And it's hard to be more specific than that, but basically if you are unwilling or unable to commit specifically to what pattern the results you would expect, chances are there are these multiple patterns that would support your data, and you should be thinking about what those patterns are. Yeah.
What's an example of a family of tests?
So the one that I motivated this question with are there differences between states. The family of tests, there might be the different pairwise comparisons between states. It gets a little bit slippery, and that's why I said that this is hard and not like always straightforward, because I also think that all planned orthogonal contrasts might also be used to support that hypothesis. But there are an infinite number of planned orthogonal contrasts, and it would be impossible to correct for all of those. So I don't think that there's an easy answer here. I'll get to a procedure called the Scheffé test, which I don't actually like that much, but it is suitable for that kind of situation where just anything goes. So I'll show you how to do that. That might be the solution there. I think that it would also be reasonable to say, okay, I'm just going to define those 10 pairwise comparisons that I talked about as my family and find all of those and then do some correction afterwards. I think that would also be reasonable. But I don't think that this is a situation where there's like always one correct answer. There are multiple answers that are reasonable, and you have to choose one. So this is the hypothesis that I motivated this lecture by, and I guess like the things I was just talking about there on this this hypothesis. So I think the family of pairwise comparisons between groups might be one reasonable family. That's probably the one that I choose here. In an earlier lecture, one of the hypotheses that we examined is that both alcohol and expectations about them have an effect, but it's not, we're not going to be more specific than that. I think you might have a reasonable argument that the two effects that bear on this hypothesis are somewhat independent of each other and should belong in different families. But I noted in that lecture that if you keep adding on extra groups that you're examining, so let's say that you examine different dosages of alcohol, or different kinds of alcohol, or different presentations of alcohol. So you add in extra experimental groups. At a certain point, I think one might start to wonder if these comparisons all truly belong in different families. I think probably one might think that they should be in the same family. But like I said, this is one area of defining families where there aren't like cut and dry rules, and it's hard, it's ambiguous. So unfortunately, I don't have like a single answer for you as to how to do this. You just have to make an argument and see if it's persuasive to other people. And ideally, you're thinking about these questions before you see your data. In psychology, we have some conventions about what usually constitute families, although, again, I don't think these conventions are right. They're just what people normally do. So normally in psychology, there's a convention that main effects, so if you have a multiple degree of freedom categorical variable, and that constitutes one main effect. Everything that goes into that main effect is often considered to be one family. And if you have an interactive model where the interaction constitutes multiple degrees of freedom, you have several contrasts that all go into it. All those contrasts in the interaction is often considered to be one field. These are conventions. I don't think that it's not like they're objectively correct. This is just what people in psychology typically do. Okay, so once you've chosen your family, you have a huge variety of choices for how to do a correction to your alpha level, to make sure that the alpha level for the family doesn't go beyond whatever you set it to be, so maybe 0.05. There are a ton of these. The one that I think is most flexible in that I see pretty often is this center one, Bonferroni. That's the one that I'm going to emphasize the most and teach you how to do in lab. It's also very easy and flexible. You can apply it to basically any situation you want. So like I said, that's what I'm going to emphasize the most. Different subfields have different conventions about which correction procedure they prefer to see. You often see this third procedure, Chaffee tests, in textbooks. I don't see it as often in papers anymore, but I'm going to teach you how to do it. I think this first procedure is probably what you'll see most in papers. So anyway, point being, there are a ton of these, really a ton. I think during the 70s and 80s, there was sort of a cottage industry of inventing these multiple comparison procedures. So yeah, there were a lot of them. And that's where I'll refer you to the Kirk paper if you want to read up more about this, or the chapter rather. So protective testing is one that we've talked about in passing already. What this involves is doing an omnibus test before you look at any specific comparisons that you might be interested in. So this is the statistical model that we're working with in this 5 design where we have different states. What this means is you set as your null model in your null model, you fix all of the coefficients for the contrast to 0. So that's the null model. And then in the alternative model, you use everything. So you allow the coefficients to not be 0. And to do that omnibus test, you just compare the sum of square errors in the null and alternative models, the compact and the augmented models. And we've actually done this. So you fit a compact model with an intercept only, not augmented model with everything, and then you compare them using model comparison. Once you've done that, if and only if you get a significant result here, so if and only if the p-value is below whatever your alpha threshold is, you look at the specific contrast curve is. And it's really as simple as that. So the reason that this works is that the alpha that you set for this comparison right here, beyond this comparison, that's your family-wise alpha. So that's the threshold that you're setting for this family of comparisons. And then the contrast that you actually have in here, those are the ones that you're saying belong in that family. This is very common. A lot of people do it without. I think it's like, I think a lot of people do this approach even when it's their specific research question might be better suited to another approach. So like looking at a focused contrast and then testing whether the residual contrast is small. I'd say this is like the default mode for a multi-group design in psychology. So the benefits of this approach is that it's pretty easy and intuitive. The costs are that these contrasts that you add to the model are the ones that are protected, and it's not always possible to, sometimes there are other sets of contrasts that might also be of interest. So I mentioned how in this like design where you have multiple states and you're interested in all possible pairwise comparisons between states. Well, the only comparisons that you can represent in your augmented model are between one particular reference group and each of the other groups. So you can't get the comparisons between things that aren't the reference group.
Is that for all omnibus testing?
There are procedures that borrow this idea of omnibus testing, but then do something extra to get some extra comparisons. That's what the Shipley test is.
But in general, omnibus testing, you just use like one group and you compare it to every other thing.
Yeah, you create whatever your set of contrasts is, and you add those the augmented model, and those are the ones that you test. So even though this is an approach that is often used, I think it's usually not the best one when you're in this mode of doing exploratory comparisons. But like I said, I've often seen it. The second approach is one that I think is generally quite good, and it's extremely flexible. Instead of putting up like this initial barrier that you have to pass in order to look at the follow-up tests, the way this works is you directly correct the alpha levels of whatever tests you do. So you do all the tests, you get the p-values, and then you either correct the alpha level below 0.05 for each of those tests, or equivalently, you basically multiply the p-values by some number and compare it to 0.5. The logic behind this is that, let's say that I have, I do 2 tests, and those are all the tests that belong in the family tests I'm interested in. I want to make sure that the alpha level for that family is 0.5. If I do 2 separate tests, each with a test-wise alpha level of 0.05, the new alpha level for that family of 2 is going to be 0.10 or less. So it could be as high as 0.10, but it also could be less. So the logic is maybe one way to make sure that your family-wise alpha level is never, at least never larger than 0.05, is you just divide the alpha level for each of your two tests by 2, by the number of tests that you perform. If you do this, the alpha level for the family, so the probability of making at least one mistake across the two tests, is never going to be larger than 0.05. It may be smaller, but it's at least never going to be larger. So, goal achieved. We've done what we wanted to do. We've controlled the alpha level at least to 0.05. So the Bonferroni procedure is very simple. If you do some number of tests, 5 or 6 or 7, if you do, say, 7 tests, you divide the alpha level for each of those tests by 7. So 0.05 divided by 7. Or equivalently, you multiply the p-values by 7. It turns out that this is actually a very conservative procedure. Conservative here means that the actual alpha level that you end up with is much smaller than 0.05. It also is a very, if the null hypothesis is actually false in reality, this procedure decreases your power by a lot. So there are a bunch of improvements to this procedure to make the correction slightly less harsh. So instead of dividing the alpha level by 7, you divide it by some smaller number. You do a correction that's just a little bit less harsh. One of those methods is called the home Bonferroni procedure. That's the one that I recommend. I'll show you in just a little bit. It's very simple to do the home Bonferroni procedure rather than the Bonferroni procedure. There's a paper that describes how it works. Details, I think, are not super important. Just know that it's less conservative. In general, I'd say the benefits of Bonferroni, home Bonferroni, is another procedure called SEDAC. Like I said, there are a ton of these. The benefits of all of these is that they're easy to do computationally, they're pretty intuitive, and no matter what your family of tests is, it'll work. So there are no restrictions. The cons, the things that are not so good about these procedures, is that they're very, very conservative. Imagine you're working with fMRI data. You get some measurements across thousands or even millions of voxels. Or let's say you're working with geospatial data. So you have some measure across lots of units of land, perhaps millions of them, because Google Maps is crazy. If you're doing millions of tests or thousands of tests and dividing your alpha level by that 1,000 or that million, that's pretty ridiculous. But that's literally how this works, right? Home Bonferroni is a little bit less conservative, but it's still very conservative. Nevertheless, you do see this used sometimes in cases where you have like thousands of tests. So I believe most of the multiple comparison procedures for fMRI data are related to the Bonferroni. So just be aware, this is a fine procedure. I think it's perfectly good, and I recommend it. But it will result in power loss if the null hypothesis is actually false. So you should design your study with that in mind. Like a lot of data, or do some other things to make sure that to offset that power loss. Here's how you do it. You just need some number of p-values. I'm showing you here how to extract p-values from a model object that you create using LM. I could have instead said C p-value, whatever the number is for p-value 1, p-value 2, p-value 3. Literally, it's just a vector of numbers that you feed into this little function. You say p.adjust, whatever those p-values are, the uncorrected ones, and then you say you want the whole procedure, and these are your corrected p-values. That's it.
So can you explain why C4 didn't change?
So the home Bonferroni method only corrects some of the p-values. It's an iterative procedure. It starts with the smallest, that the smallest p-value gets the harshest correction, and then it goes on up through the p-values until it reaches a stopping point. So it just didn't, that procedure ended up stopping before it got to C4. Questions? So the last one is Scheffé. And one nice thing about Scheffé is that if you're working in a research design that Scheffé covers, so Scheffé likes big multi-curve designs, then you don't have to define a family. So that part is you don't have to worry about. But you do pay a penalty for using Scheffé. So the way it works, you still have to do this procedure of doing protective tests. But Scheffé, in addition, does a correction to the p-values that you get for each individual contrast. So that's really the extra price that you pay for not defining a family. It's that you apply a really harsh correction to everything that you get from the model. I don't use Scheffé very often. I was looking for a nice user-friendly function that does Scheffé. I found one that's user-friendly, but not as flexible as I'd like. I'm going to show that to you here. I kind of wish that I had other options, but anyway, I'll show you what I found. The way it works, by the way, it doesn't work by correcting p-values. Instead, it modifies the test statistic that you compare the one that you observe to. So, you can define a critical test statistic, the threshold beyond which anything is significant. It modifies that critical test statistic. Here's the function that I found. It's from a package called Agricole. What I don't like about it is that it only allows you to look at pairwise comparisons. And technically, mathematically, Scheffé allows you to do any contrast you want, linear, quadratic, it doesn't really matter. But you can't do that in this package. So if you want to know more about this, I recommend that you go to the Kirk paper, read about the Scheffé method, and maybe you'll find a package that implements this, or maybe you can do the correction on your own. But I'm showing you that there's a way to do it that's at least covers some of the cases that you might encounter, and the way it works anyway is by modifying that critical test statistic. So yeah, the cases where you might think about using Scheffé is when you have a categorical variable with really a lot of bubbles. which gives you, of course, lots and lots and lots of comparisons that you could investigate, where you really have no idea which comparisons you want to test, where you just have no theory provides no guidance. This is a pretty good method to use in that specific situation. I mentioned this already, but I should say though, if you are doing exploratory research, you might think about focusing on estimation, not really thinking that much about p-values or basing your interpretations on them. I think that's a perfectly legitimate way to go. I see that approach sometimes in papers. So Chaffee is pretty good in the cases where it fits. And like I said, even though I couldn't find a function that allowed you to do lots of custom contrasts, the basic principle, the basic idea applies to almost any contrast you can think of, or literally any contrast you can think of. But it is very conservative. That's the price that you pay for not even defining the family. It's slightly less general than Bonferroni or home Bonferroni, which is why I generally like those methods best, personally. So, okay. Here are the basic principles behind corrections for multiple comparisons. Sometimes you're working in an area where you have either no hypothesis or a vague one. What vague means here is that you could use multiple different kinds of patterns of means to say that your hypothesis is supported. That's the key element that you're looking for. And again, there's nothing wrong with being in that situation. That's if you're in psychology, for example, or any sort of social science, I think most of our research actually is exploratory in some way. But if you are doing exploratory research, that's when you might need to think about families of hypotheses that could support or families of tests that could support your main hypothesis. So the procedure that you need to follow is to define what that family is, or maybe you have several families if you have a couple independent sets of hypotheses or a couple independent theories that you're investigating. And then apply some sort of procedure to correct the error rate, the type 1 error rate for that family. And there are lots of methods available, though I tend to like the Holm-Bonferroni best. We're done with categorical variables. This is the last lecture on this topic, although it probably will come up again in different ways later in the semester. So we covered generally 3 cases where you might be thinking about categorical variables with more than 3 levels. The really planned version where you have a specific hypothesis and you look at departures from that specific hypothesis. Planned pairwise comparisons where you might have a couple of independent hypotheses that don't really bear on each other. And unplanned comparisons where those potential tests that you could do all bear on some central idea. Which situation you're in, as I hope you've seen, has a lot of impact on how you approach these categorical variables. We are also done with the general linear model. Believe it or not, you've covered basically anything that you could want to do with the general linear model. Maybe certain areas are fuzzier than others, but so I showed this table in the first semester, or sorry, in the first lecture of the semester. We've added these 4 specific types of situations, each of which has their own name. So ANOVA, ANCOVA, multi-way ANOVA. And like I said, this is everything that you might want to do with the general linear model. Like, this is it. Congratulations. One thing that I hope you notice is how confused the terminology is on this side of the table. When really you can think about all these different cases as adding specific kinds of parameters that ask questions that you would care about. So for the rest of the semester, we're going to be covering extensions. We'll be building on these basic ideas, but we'll be making slight twists that allow us to handle other cases that you might hear. Thanks very much. I'll be covering drill for Austin on Thursday and Friday, so I'll see them.
Are you actually going to be there on Friday?
Well, I prefer not to. How many people can make it to Friday?
Well,
Only
because he
Friday.
had told us that you were just going to record it and that Friday would just watch it like you did last week.
I definitely prefer to do that.
Okay.
Because that might allow me to. Is that okay with everybody? Okay. I'll just do it on Thursday.